While we are getting questions from the audience for you, I would like to ask you to give numbers if you can about the maturing of these documentation experiment pieces. So 2 weeks ago, Alvin Cho, who was talking about the Pfizer building, he was talking about, okay, you need to wait a little bit with evaluating what you measured because things have to mature. And obviously, that maturing time depends on traffic. Now, how would you gauge that and then decide to kill or not to kill something, documentation or feature that you put out there so as to not to clutter the view? How do you know if you actually have enough information? James, you were pretty like strict, like, okay, 8%, good, 3%,
Yeah,
good, out.
yeah. Well, so I think, in terms of making those decisions, right, like it all comes back to having a clear outcome from the beginning, right? Like, what are we trying to achieve? And then having meaningful measures to assess whether or not we achieve that. Like I said in the presentation, that's why I recommend a lot of key measures for something like an experiment, right? Because if you're just looking at any one thing, like if we were to just look in the example at number of active apps from use cases alone, right? That's a very like variable thing. From a retail company, right? We may see an organic increase at certain times of the year, right? Leading up to the holidays, we'd likely see an increase in folks wanting to integrate with us, things like that, right? So very strategic about how we quantify success, I think, is critical. And if you're strategic about that, it actually makes the decision on when do we pivot extremely easy, right?
Mhm.
Now, there's always some, and that's why I call it assessing the results, right? Like, because there's always some human, aspect there, right? Like, we really need to think through, like, well, okay, but if we combine these two metrics that we, saw, is this successful actually? Because these other two is telling us no, right? So there's always that human factor. But I just think, as long as you have a clear outcome of what you're trying to achieve and you have multiple ways to measure that you're actually moving the needle, it makes a lot of those decisions very easy. And again, data driven. So um, I don't want to say they're painted right there for you, but, the data will paint a pretty good picture if you're intentional about what you're measuring.
My background is a bit more in user research and observation, and I absolutely believe in the value of experiments and trying things out. But I would kind of say that I think adding the context of human conversations with the developers who you are targeting gives you another dimension to the insights you get from the experiments. I'm thinking in particular of one client project I worked on a couple of years ago where they were finding that I think it was 42% of people who clicked on sign up dropped out after the first stage of the developer sign up flow. And they proposed an experiment where they would have fewer fields in the initial page, but they would still have this gather all the same information. They just drag it out into more and more pages, more and more steps. And the experiment, showed that actually doing that made a negligible difference. I can't remember if it was up or down, but it didn't really move the needle significantly. Whereas doing observation sessions with their target developers showed that either way, at that stage, the people weren't committed enough to the solution to give all of the information that the client was looking for. And so, that's just kind of a bit of a throwaway anecdote, but to me, it illustrates the fact that you can sometimes see things in numbers that aren't necessarily there, or if you don't get what you need from the experimental results, then it doesn't hurt just to reach out and talk to people, because although you can't rely on, say, 10 people alone to give you the truth, I think it's good to have the mix.
Mhm. So before you kill something that you put out there, you should consider whether it was the right thing at the wrong time or the wrong stage.
Yeah, it's badly implemented maybe, and perhaps there's a couple of tweaks that you haven't considered and wouldn't have been shown in the numbers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that heavily. And like, if I think back to the third scenario that I gave in the presentation of, hey, like these were effective, but maybe it's placement that's, affecting us. The first thing I think there is like, hey, we might want to talk with some users, do some user testing, right? And just see like, is it placement? We might want to verify that without spending more time in development, right? And see if we can get to the bottom of that. And if talking with those users produces that result, then we could potentially define another experiment to run to then validate that in production, right? So, yeah, I 100% agree with that.
Mm-hmm. A quick tooling question for James. How do you collect experimentation data? Is it part of your content management or publishing workflow, or do you have add-ons like Google Analytics?
Yeah, we have a few solutions. So it really just depends. And that's one thing that we've been focusing on. And one thing I maybe avoided in the conversation, but, you know, one critical thing if you're going to do a lot of experiments, right, is having a solid way of implementing analytics and knowing how you're going to gather that data. Because if you don't, you'll find that, the whole point of experiments, right, is to minimize investment and learn, right? But if you're spending a week on development, but then you're spending 3 weeks implementing the analytics you need to then see if that's successful, right, it's actually counterproductive to what you're trying to do. So we use a few different analytics tools as well. We leverage quite a bit of in-app user feedback, and we've actually been leveraging that more over time. So it's one thing to have in your footer. Like we found, we have a feedback mechanism in our footer, right?
The
That's like, hey, tell us about your
simple
experience, right?
up-down, yes,
Well,
or
it's like a
trick out.
form in our footer. You
Uh-huh.
go down there, you click on submit feedback, and we found that nobody seeks that out, right? And the only people that really are going to go seek out that are probably folks that had a bad experience, right? Which is good because we want to hear from those folks. But so we started doing things like on our documentation pages, having, was this content helpful, right? Just a quick check. Can the user, within the experience, or embedding feedback mechanisms within our flow, like app registration, right? And saying, hey, is this easy, right? Just real quick checks within the application that don't take away from the experience, but put the feedback in context, right? I want the feedback from the user when they're experiencing the pain point, not after the fact when they say, hey, wait, yeah, I forgot that was kind of annoying. I'm going to go back and, submit feedback, right? So
Mm-hmm.
the more you can get the feedback right when the pain point's happening, I think the better off the feedback will be.
Mm-hmm. So next to checking the actual behavior while it's happening, like Matthew suggested, to also immediately ask while they're reading the docs. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because if you can get both analytics and feedback, you're in a really good place, right? Because I can look at the analytics and it's going to say one thing, but then if I can compare that to user feedback and say, okay, cool, so I'm seeing this discrepancy, or I'm seeing this behavior in our analytics, and now I've got actual user feedback right here for me to then go through and see if I can explain that behavior, right? So I definitely think using both and leveraging both as much as you can, is the best approach.
Mm-hmm. If this was a podcast and we had a half an hour, my next question would be, okay, and who does that? Who gets the budget to do all this? But I guess that's for the podcast. Mira has the question to both of you. Have you ever run a developer satisfaction survey on the platform itself? Any best practices or anything you want to share? Maybe I ask Matthew if you want to share some
Yeah,
stories.
so I've worked with clients who've done that, and I think in the moment, as James says, if someone's angry or particularly motivated, then they will engage. But I found that short and to the point is best for things that are happening in the platform, but with the option of providing more if they want to. So I think we're living in a world or a web at the moment where almost every action we try to take, unless you're running a really good ad blocker, is interrupted by cookie request forms, by will you recommend us to your friends, by all sorts of things that are stopping us from actually achieving what we're doing. So I think it's really important to be mindful of people's need to get on and do the thing they want to achieve. And so if you can somehow place those, don't just throw them up at random, place them at points where someone seems to have reached a point of conclusion, and keep them as short as possible. I think to me, it's better to run many shorter engagements than to throw up every 6 months a 10-page dissertation length survey.
James?
Yeah, I completely agree there. The only other thing, and to be honest, I think we're still trying to get good at this as well, right? Like soliciting feedback, any type of surveys, right? It's hard. I mean, how long have people been sending out surveys? We still haven't got it right, but I will say the one thing is, yeah, focus on the delivery of the survey, right? I you know I'll, we have not had much success with just email blasting and asking folks to provide feedback. That it doesn't seem to work. So I think to part of the point that Matthew is making, embedding it into the experience, or getting it in context, is significantly more beneficial. And especially if you do it over time versus just one time, let's email everyone and ask for feedback once a year, right? That's just a point in time. And while it can be helpful, it gets stale pretty quickly. So
One other thing I'll just very quickly say is, if you have an early access program or something where you can feature flag new experimental features and give them access to a certain group of people, then they've already shown that they are more willing to help you out. So they might be the people to focus on for that kind of thing. If you have a champions program or anything like that as well, and you really are building a community, then they're more likely to give you feedback. But you've got to be careful as well, because they're unnaturally, atypically engaged with you. So, Scott Hanselman from Microsoft always talks about the dark matter developers, the 70% of people you never hear from. And they're the ones who you need to, I guess, make more effort to engage with. Yeah.
And talking about early access, Beverly is asking, have either of you used rapid prototyping for APIs?
Not me, no.
nope.
Okay. And I have one last question. In the last, say, year or two, what is the most counterintuitive learning that you gained? I mean, as relevant to API docs.
Hmm.
I wouldn't call it counterintuitive, but I think it's worth saying that in the field of education, the idea that there are visual learners and kinetic learners and all this is being thoroughly debunked. So if you're interested in kind of pushing your documentation and your developer experience to the next level, then there's a lot of really good material out there, particularly from the Raspberry Pi Foundation, that can give you an introduction to modern pedagogy. Pedagogy, sorry. And so I wouldn't say it's necessarily counterintuitive, but I think it's kind of counter to what we've all been saying for the past 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
Is that there's a lot more to it than just saying that people are visual learners or audio learners.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would agree there. And I think offering different modes and ways of learning, is critical. Like one thing that maybe is counterintuitive is over experimenting on content and saying like, hey, for each new piece of content, we're going to experiment with different modes of communication for that content. Well, over time, you find that like, well, we're really just wasting our time, because we know we need all modes, because not everybody learns the same, right? And you'll typically see that it's a pretty wide variety. It's never 100% of your users want videos versus 100% of your users want text, right? It's always a pretty good mix. So I do think over experimenting with different modes of content eventually becomes counterintuitive, and you just take a stance that like, hey, any new content, we're gonna use these three modes because these are the ones that we're having success with, and these are the ones that we know that most users are going to want to engage with, right? So I do think there's a balance there, and you start to over experiment on certain things that you've already proven out just because you're doing a new document, right? It's not like a feature where you might build one feature and that's that, right? That is the feature. But with content, you're going to continue to create new content.
Mhm.
And you can certainly fall into the trap of over experimenting each time you create new content.
Mhm. Thank you very much. This was, I think, very useful. Hopefully, a lot of people learned a lot from it. And we are going to publish this for those who couldn't be here now in multiple formats, in whichever way they want to consume it. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And see you soon.
Hope so.
Yep.